CBS News is looking into what's driving Republican belief in widespread voter fraud. A new report by the American Association for Public Opinion Research finds public opinion polls in the 2020 presidential election suffered from errors of, quote, unusual magnitude. Surveys of the national popular vote overestimated the margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump by 3.9%. The same state-level polls were off by over 4%. Support for Donald Trump was underestimated in almost every state by around 3%. The study was done by a 19-person task force, which convenes every election cycle to examine polls at the national and state level. CBS News Deputy Director of Elections and Data Analytics, Kabir Khanna, was part of that group, and he joins me now. Hi there, Kabir. Welcome. I'm really glad that we have you to break all this down. But let's start with this new data that you've just put out today as part of its new study on voting in America. The CBS News Elections and Survey team has this new poll out on perceptions of voter fraud. What did you learn about why some Americans still believe there was widespread fraud in 2020?
Hi, Elaine. Great to be with you. Yes, so we have this new study on voting in America, and what we found with this new set of survey findings is that most Americans do not endorse this claim that there was widespread fraud in the presidential election last year. But a substantial minority of Americans still do, particularly Trump voters and Republicans. You know, while about a third of Americans overall endorse this widespread fraud claim, that number rises to about 7 in 10 among Republicans and Trump voters. And this really speaks to the political moment we find ourselves in, where about a third of Americans do not consider the Biden presidency legitimate, saying Biden did not legitimately win the election last year. And also it's connected to this push to restrict voting in more and more states. One of the interesting things we found in this study is that when you ask Republicans and Trump voters, where did this widespread fraud occur, they really display a connection to partisan politics. So they tend to pinpoint Democratic communities and constituencies. For example, they're much more likely to say fraud happened in cities and urban areas than they are to say it happened in suburban areas and rural parts of the country where more Republicans live. They're also slightly more likely to attribute fraud to communities of color than to white communities. And they also say a lot of fraud happened with mail ballots, echoing a claim President Trump and other Republican leaders have made many times, more than it happened with Election Day voting. Now, I should say there's, of course, no actual evidence for these claims. The research on this is unequivocal. Fraud happens very rarely, if at all, and courts rejected a litany of legal challenges to last year's election. Nonetheless, we thought it was important to dive into these misperceptions to understand what's driving them and how they connect to the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, and it's important to also understand the broader sort of context of this moment as we see the political rhetoric again ramping up here ahead of the midterms. But Kabir, let's turn to polling in general. So as we said, you were part of this task force put together by the American Association for Public Opinion Research, 19 people on that task force. What did you find about election polling in 2020? And does the group always put together this kind of postmortem?
Yes, we do. So the American Association for Public Opinion Research, known as APOR colloquially, is basically the trade association for pollsters and survey researchers. And every election cycle, APOR proactively convenes a special task force that, once an election is over, can cull through all the data released about that election, so going through all the polls it can get its hands on to evaluate how accurate they were and to compare the error in one election against previous cycles. So what we found this year by going through mountains of data, basically every public poll that we could find that had some information about how it was conducted, for example, whether it was done online or by phone, how it was weighted in many cases. We looked at all those and found that the average error was indeed higher than in recent years when you look at how polls estimated Biden's margin versus what his margin ended up being. So on average, the polls overestimated Biden's national popular vote margin by about 4 points. Now, I would say that's not huge in absolute terms, but obviously in a close election, a handful of points can make a really big difference. I think that what's more interesting in this report than that headline about the average error is a dive into what might be producing this error. So the first thing we did was look at some of the explanations for the smaller polling error in 2016. And a lot of that was attributed to two factors: a lack of pollsters making sure their samples were representative of the educational status of Americans, or of voters, I should say, and the prevalence of late deciders, so people who are on the fence between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and then swung disproportionately to Trump late in the campaign. Well, we looked at whether both of those explanations could be at play in 2020, and neither seems to be the case. Pollsters overwhelmingly weighted to education, and there were very few late deciders in the 2020 campaign. It was a very stable race. We were also able to rule out other hypotheses that have been put forward, like shy Trump voters or problems with modeling who would actually turn out versus who would stay home. And the evidence for those theories is pretty thin too. So we were left with a few likely explanations for the errors in 2020. One is what's known as differential non-response. That's a technical term, but it basically means that in this case, Democrats and Republicans are participating in surveys at different rates. That Democrats are more likely to want to opt in to take the surveys, and Republicans and Trump voters are more likely to opt out. Now, that's, I think, a very plausible explanation. I think it's in line with a lot of the rhetoric we've seen that came from the Trump campaign, that that they weren't shy about bashing the polls and criticizing the media. So I think that's a very plausible explanation, but it's very hard to prove. Another big thing that happened in 2020 was an explosion in turnout and lots of new voters entering the electorate and marginal voters. And I think one thing that happened is that the polls' estimates of how that group would vote were much more democratic than they ended up being in a lot of the decisive states. So again, these, I think, are the explanations that are most likely, but it's going to take more work to nail down exactly what's going on and exactly how to fix it going forward.
So, Kabir, we're running out of time, but we're going to continue this discussion. For now, though, I want to kind of leave viewers with this idea of what it is they should keep in mind when they look at various data points, when they see polling, when they see polls, given what you have learned and what you all have seen, not just with this election cycle in 2020, but 2016 and the election cycles before. What do you think it is that people need to have in the back of their minds as they look at some of these numbers?
That's a great question. First of all, I'll say that this report was on election polling, which is its own special beast, right? It's not about polling in general, which is highly accurate and provides a really important signal in our democracy about what everyday people think and feel about the issues of the day. Without it, we're stuck with the voices of those in power dominating the conversation. So I think it's really important to pay attention to. Things to keep in mind are statistical uncertainty, the margin of error in each poll that's inherent. Polling is a snapshot in time. It's not itself a prediction of what's going to happen. People sometimes use polls to make prediction, but it's not the same thing. So it's an imperfect snapshot in time. And the other thing is to be very humble about what the data actually say and what they don't say. One thing we always stress with the CBS News poll is go beyond the top line and go beyond the horse race. Don't focus only on who's winning and losing, but try to understand why people feel the way they do. And I think polls can be really useful in that respect. For example, in 2020, we told really important stories about the trade-off people felt between battling coronavirus and the economy, the suburban shift among voters and independents. And so those sorts of in-depth analyses, I think, are only possible with survey data, and the industry is always striving for accuracy, transparency, and innovation, and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to do that in the next cycle.
Right, because leading up to 2020, I remember distinctly having conversations over and over based around the polling about just how things looked so unpredictable or unable to kind of predict what would happen in, say, Arizona and what would happen, in Georgia. And as we saw, those are razor thin margins there. So those battleground trackers that you all did painted a picture, I think, for viewers, and from my perspective, allowed us to understand come election night why those particular contests were so close. Kabir Khanna, Kabir, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Elaine.